Hey, this is Michael Gelbart, and I want to shift some perspectives in what it means to tell ancestor stories. We have all kinds of stories that we tell about the stories that we have. Some people say they don't have stories of their ancestors. They don't know the stories of their grandparents or their great-grandparents. And many people don't have the grandparent stories or the great-grandparent stories. And there are many people that feel quite sad about that. They didn't ask their parents or their grandparents what those stories were. Others have been adopted and they don't know the genetic or bloodline lineage stories of their ancestors. And others, families have moved away from another country or moved away from one coast of America to the other coast. And the families were left behind, and so were the stories. So there are variations in how much of these stories we've heard, and also variations in how interested we are in hearing those stories, and also variations in our own development as to our interest in these stories. So why is it important, first of all, to explore these stories? Well, I would say that there's a lot of background information that we don't know about ourselves that's informing us nonetheless. So like these groves of trees, we don't know where they've come from, but we know they've come from very ancient times. And we can sense that when we feel the ancientness of these trees, when we tune into the ground. And so ancestors are connected with the ancient and antecedents, what's before us, what's come before us. And we all only know so many explicit stories, be it of our parents or our uncles and aunts or our grandparents or great-grandparents. Some people can track their stories back in lineages and generations over many generations, and others not so much. There's another perspective we can have about these stories. So first of all, we're all starting from the stories we have about the stories that we have. And that narrative we actually have a lot of agency with. We can make things up, so I would invite us to be mindful of what we're making up. We've been told things. Our parents are like, well, we don't know anything about what happened in Ireland before we moved here. Well, that's very possible. Those stories got discontinued, so to speak. They didn't have the continuity over time of being passed down from generation to generation. And that is very sad. There's a lot of grief that people feel of not having those stories. And other cultures have been able to maintain and sustain the stories of the generations, not always of the explicit people. So I have so many generational stories back in my Judaic cultural heritage, which I feel really blessed by. We go all the way back in time to the forefathers, to Noah, to the Garden of Eden, back to the ancient ones. And there's a way in which that lineage generationally, though it isn't explicitly my great-great-grandparents and whatever their names were, or whoever they were as characters and personalities, living in Poland, living in Eastern Europe, nonetheless, that background informs us. So be it the lands we come from, the migrational patterns, the songs, the prayers, the belief systems, the languages, the cultures, the costumes, the occupations, all of these are different access routes to the stories. So first of all, I would invite you to engage your own curiosity into what the story is that you're telling about your ancestors, previous generations, grandparents, great-grandparents, and just to notice in your body, how does that feel to you? Do you feel sad about not knowing? Do you feel disinterested? Do you feel angry? Do you feel ashamed? Do you feel nothing? So our story that we have is an access route. Also somatically, what's embodied? So if I share a story about my lineage, my grandparents, or the culture that I come from, what does that evoke in you? So when we're attuning to each other, we actually get clues. And we're getting clues all the time when we're listening. And my story can evoke or invoke something in you, and your story can evoke or invoke something in me. So there's this mutual attunement and resonance that's so important when sharing and listening to these stories that can clue us in to sort of hidden, invisible frameworks that are in the matrix, that are in the backgrounds of who we are explicitly, like backgrounds, foregrounds. So I invite you to consider investigating from a different perspective beyond having the explicit stories, let's say of your grandparents or your great-grandparents, and see if you can engage your curiosity. And also generationally, if you're in your 20s or your 30s or your 40s, this may feel more important down the line. Like, I got interested in this when I was 20. I just became fascinated in studying the multi-generational lineage of my parents, ancestor, Holocaust survivors, and what happened before I dove in. And others don't dive in. They want to stay out of the water. They're not interested. They want to move forward in time and progenerate. And that's perfectly great. So I just invite you to be curious with the stories that you are telling. Also, what's happening somatically in your body when someone is sharing stories. And I also want to invite you to really, I want to say this, to really consider now interviewing any living relatives. They may be aunts, they may be uncles, they may be cousins, previous generations that may have the stories in the backgrounds that can also provide some more food to your own versions or your own perceptions of your historical background. Ask about the great-grandparents. Ask your grandmother, if she's still alive, to tell you about her grandparents. Go peripheral. Go as wide as you can. Not your childhood, but your parents' childhoods. Ask them about their childhoods. What do they remember? Early memories. Ask about their as far back as they can remember. And the farther back you can go with the stories you have with the elders, more information can come in. So I encourage you to consider that. You can also reach out to me if you want very specific questions that you can ask. I will be connecting a document here to this YouTube channel on the kinds of questions you can ask to any elders that are still there alive and available. And one last bit of good news, of course, is that yes, while we lose short-term memory as we get older, what happens with elders is they maintain their longer-term memories. So even if there's dementia, you can ask these elders about their young childhood experiences and they'll tell you. So I encourage you to ask. Thanks for listening. Whatever ancestors means to you or generational wisdom that we can that you feel called to, I would invite you to invoke that in your life and bring and share to the collective. All right, Michael Gelbart, Shift in Perspective. Thanks for listening.